Third is the host pastor. LEAD stands for liberation, encouragement, and deliverance. Now, let's join Dr. Baxter for Stop the Madness, an important panel discussion on race, religion, and politics.
Good evening and welcome to this conversation, this roundtable discussion. I am Pastor Wallace C. Baxter III, pastor of the Second Baptist Church Southwest here in District Heights, Maryland, and I certainly welcome you to this conversation, this discussion. I'm excited about it. We're going to have an awesome time today as we discuss under the theme race, religion, and politics. Stop the madness. Where do we go from here, basically? There's a lot going on around us, a lot going on in this world. And I believe that God is calling those who are leaders to stand up, to speak up, and to show up. Even in this time of social distancing and pandemic and all this stuff, to still show up in many ways, in whatever way they can. And this is one way that we are showing up, even virtually, in order to address some of the issues that are going on and some of the just challenges that we face, and hopefully maybe even provide some prescriptions and solutions. I believe that there are some individuals who are gathered together today that can do just that. So I welcome Dr. Maurice Wallace, Dr. Dominique Robinson, and Dr. Lester McCorn to join in this conversation. I will say by way of introduction that Dr. Maurice Wallace is a professor of English at Rutgers University in New Jersey. He is both a scholar and a preacher as well, and we're grateful to have him with us this day. Then I'll say Dr. Lester McCorn is the president of Clinton College in Rock Hill, South Carolina. He is a great leader, but he's also a preacher as well. And so he knows both the academy and the pulpit. And then, of course, none other than the Reverend Dr. Dominique Robinson, Dean Dominique Robinson. She is an awesome woman of God. She is also the dean of the chapel at Wiley College in Texas, and she is a scholar in her own right and just a ministry guru, as I like to call her, because she always comes up with innovative ways of doing ministry. And so I'm grateful to know her and grateful to call her sister. And so we are here with a couple of my brothers and my sister, and I just want to open this thing up by saying, how are you all doing in this pandemic?
Lord have mercy.
Much better these days than a few months ago. Thank God.
For sure. I would definitely say I am pandemically progressing right now.
That's a good way to put
Pandemically
it.
progressing. I like that.
I'm going to use that, Dean.
I like that. So I kind of want to jump right into this conversation. When we're looking at this idea of race, religion, and politics, I kind of want to invite everyone into conversations that we have on a day-to-day basis, conversations that we always have about race, about religion, about politics, and the intersectionality of all of that, because all of them inform the other in some way. And hopefully through this conversation, we'll unpack that a little bit. And so I really wanted to just invite everyone in to one of our normal conversations that we might have with some of our peers, scholars, and friends. And so with that, I think that one of the biggest challenges, at least as I see it, with, let's just say, if we can talk about with church folk, right, with disciples of Christ, is that when we look at these various issues of race and of politics and all these things, they tend to separate these things. and not look at it through what you might call a theological lens or a Christian lens or what have you. And so I wonder if you feel as though every church member, every disciple of Christ can be a theologian, or if they are a theologian. I read in Stone and Duke, who wrote a theology primer, basically, that to be Christian is to be a theologian. What are your thoughts on that statement? What are your thoughts on that phraseology?
Well, I'm inclined to agree that we are by default already theologians. We might not be self-consciously theologians, but to the degree that we have an ethical orientation to the world, to the degree that we seek to live out our lives according to the professions of our faith, then we are doing theology in a practical way. When I was first introduced to the phrase practical theology, I just assumed that it meant our practices, our everyday faith walk was already a reflection of what we believe, or was the most honest reflection of what we believe. Now, I came to understand later that those who were employing the phrase as professional theologians were really more interested in trying to get everyday people to alter their behaviors so that their behaviors would fit orthodox belief. But my feeling is that practical theology is probably most honest when we observe what our everyday behaviors are saying about our theological beliefs before we try to adjust to something that is more conventional or something that is more orthodox in sort of academic theological terms. So that's a long answer to a short question. And my answer is absolutely, we're already theologians. We might make the distinction between professional theologians and non-professional theologians, or conscious theologians and unconscious theologians, but we are already always doing that, in my opinion.
Yeah, because I think there's like a fear of the terminology sometimes, even in a church setting in particular, like that you throw the term out, theology, and they instantly think about the academic discipline only. And I think I agree. I think there is, definitely.
But it's not their fault.
No,
It's not their fault, because academics have pretended to have a monopoly
right.
on an understanding of who God is. And so the academy has created a certain kind of distance and placed theology in an ivory tower that makes everybody else think that they can't really access that. My opinion again.
Oh, I like that.
You said we were having a conversation,
Yeah,
right?
I like that.
Always
What's your opinion, Dr. Dominique?
Well, I first think that anybody, not just a Christian, who believes
Okay.
God or a deity, then can be considered a practical theologian
Like that.
if their life, based off of a moral compass or ethical management, is coming from the lens of engaging God. And so I first kind of want to take away the Christianity component of this idea of theological engagement. And that might be the womanist in me, right? So it might be the fact that, hey, there are other people who can be considered theologians, but I certainly see particularly Black Christians create that divide between the academy and the church, and then the use of this language that continues the divide. So yes, I do believe that those of us who have a moral compass, who are trying to live an ethical life that lines up with the deity and the practices of that God, then are theologians in praxis. But then there is a transition between being a professional theologian or a theological scholar, which brings about this idea of study and becoming an expert in an area. And then even in that, realizing that there's diversity amongst what it means to be a theologian, because you got the public theologian, you got the political theologian, right? You have the genderized theologian. And so to know that there are all these concepts and areas connected to, again, the lens of how are we studying God and how is God engaging us in this world? I think when people start to realize all of these kind of antennas connected to this word or this field, they realize that we're all connected to it. And so even when I'm talking to a Muslim brother or sister, they themselves can be a theologian as well, based off of us trying to figure out, like you said, separating race, politics, and theology or religion. We're trying to figure out a race, resolve coming from different religious perspectives. We're both theologians at the table having this conversation. And so that's my perspective on it. But I'm gonna pass it over to President McCorn.
Well, thank you, Dean Robinson. I don't have much to add. I think you all brilliantly described it. I mean, I would just add one other descriptor, which might be the distinction, and maybe a false distinction, between vernacular theologians and vocational theologians. Right? Wow. I think that, vernacular kind of denotes more of a contextual, kind of indigenous, everyday, grassroots kind of theology, which both of you have alluded to, that I think happens, both in church and out of church. I mean, it's just something that's kind of organic. And so in that regard, I do believe, to your question, Dr. Baxter, that everybody can be a theologian. But then there is the vocational part, which probably has a little more responsibility on it. And it does point to more of a professional theologian who has engaged the discipline, both historically and in a contemporary context. And I've often wondered how you could be a theologian without being a practical theologian. But since our conversation before we began kind of talked about the ivory tower, right? And so there is, kind of to Dr. Wallace's point, I think there is a tendency to advance the aims of the ivory tower, which churches become complicit with, right? We need trained clergy, we need leaders of the church, so we feed them to these institutions that are supposed to refine their minds and their thinking and then send them back to the church. But I've always loved, I think it was William Farley, or maybe Ed Farley, who talked about the concept of habitus, which is really, theology in everyday life. Dr. Robinson kind of talked about sort of the ethical considerations that are imbued with theological thinking, but it's much more than the constraints that we put on theology. And I always point to James Cone, right, who just turned the whole thing upside down by proving that most theologians were out of touch, and that the Black church was running the risk of following in that same vein of just creating these philosophers of theology who were not rooted and grounded in the everyday experiences of the oppressed.
Wow. Yeah. And speaking of being out of touch, there seem to be those around in this nation, especially right now, who are out of touch. And I guess I'll cover this way. If I were to say we hold these truths to be self-evident, what comes to mind?
Who is we?
There you go, right there.
Who is we? And what truths? Like what truths? I mean, clearly we know this is from one of the founding documents of our country, of our nation, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, that all men are created equal, is what it actually says.
All white property holding men.
Right. And we can put all those those descriptors on there. All white male property holding men. Yes. And are created equal. And yet these documents still So, like for instance, if I bring it to the Black church for a second, right? In the Black church, when we find that our Constitution just doesn't suit us anymore, we call a whole committee together. We don't just add amendments. No, we rip the thing to shreds and come up with a whole new Constitution and say, this is us now, right? Perhaps, I don't know, is there a need for this nation perhaps to reevaluate its founding documents in such a way that you actually craft something that fits your current makeup? I don't know. I mean, because amendments are one thing, but we know many of those amendments have expiration dates attached to them. They have to come up in Congress every 2-3 years to extend the lifetime of those amendments, particularly like the right to vote for Black folks, things like that have come up in the past. And so, how do we live? How do we survive in a nation that seems structured to hold us back? Seems built to do that.
So I might also suggest a variation on your question, which is, do our current circumstances demand that we consider reframing the country as we know it, reframing our understanding, reframing our conception of the nation? Since, of course, those founding documents were intended to lay the groundwork for framing, building, structuring a nation. So your question is, I think, the primary one. I just wanted to see if we might also consider what some of the implied questions are, the subordinate questions that go with the primary one, especially since you, I think, very correctly identify those documents as lending structure to a nation, a history, and a society that, frankly, works for some and doesn't work for others. And the degree to which it works for some is precisely because it doesn't work for others. If that makes sense. So I just wanted to offer those subordinate questions to the primary one.
Yeah. Dr. McCoy, you got anything to add?
Oh yeah, I think Dr. Wallace is right on it. It really is, the question is, who does it benefit? Who is privileged? And obviously, if you benefit from it, you have no interest in changing it. You want to see how you can exploit it, how you can gain advantage from it. So I mean, I think that a perfect example is 45's obsession with getting rid of critical race theory, right? Just throwing it out the window because it is a direct threat to the house that was already built. They just want to do some renovations, some minor renovations to the house, change the drapes, bring in some more furniture, that kind of thing. But the whole house is corrupt, right? It was unequal from its very beginning. And that, I mean, that's the question that they don't want to, they want to suppress that. They want to disqualify it from any part of the conversation. And it is precisely that reason. I mean, the reason we have amendments is because we recognize that the original Constitution was incomplete and imperfect, right? And so you have to amend it. But it does beg the question, why was it imperfect? What was that really about? So that's what, and I think Black Lives Matter, the newest iteration of the movement after the death of George Floyd, called all of that into question. And you had so many white allies and other allies that had an awakening, like, wow, we didn't realize how we benefited from the imperfections of this system. And so we need to question the whole system.
Definitely. I agree with both what both Dr. Wallace and Dr. McCorn have shared from the very first, the question you asked, Pastor Baxter. I thought to myself, I don't know if we live in conditions that demand us ripping that Constitution to shreds and starting over again, because there are so many people who benefit from it and see nothing wrong with it and are okay with the amendments having an expiration, because to them the amendment didn't matter, or you just got by with that Civil Rights Act. It's okay. At that, it was important in that time, in that moment. And I agree with the fact that this new, like you said, this new wave, movement for Black Lives, or Black Lives Movement, however they're naming it and terming it now. I believe that it's those who are in privilege, who have a good stewardship of their influence, that suddenly helps the shift for those who have been suffering. We didn't see improvement with the women's suffrage movement until there were some men in place who saw the need, right? We saw a shift even with the civil rights movement when white people saw the dogs and the fire, the hose being used. There was a shift, and even now there is persons who have able bodies who can help change legislation for those who are differently and disabled. It's now those who are heterosexual who can help to change whatever's necessary for those who are queer. It's about whatever privilege we have, using that privilege and being a good steward of it to help us make the shift. But if we're talking about that Constitution, there are so many persons right now in these supposed United States of America who are benefiting from it that would prevent those of us who need it to change to even get it to change. And so it's like, do we rip that to shred? Do we add an amendment? How do we even get to that? Particularly when we have a person who is the chief officer, like you said, Dr. McCorn, who's so busy trying to get rid of, critical race theory or TikTok instead of Twitter.
Right, that part.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah.
And I agree. I'm right there with y'all, especially with this new latest iteration of Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Movement, what have you. Yes, because it's as though and social media has helped with this a lot, that you're able to put things out there that have been going on for years. We know it's been going on a long time. We all got family members that have been victims. We've got friends that have been victims, or of these various things. And in this moment, it's as though all of a sudden a light bulb has gone off, which I think is a good thing. Now we all know, as Dr. Maurice Wallace used to tell me, you always have to have that one ally, that one compassionate, sometimes conservative, but compassionate white friend that will stand with you because they truly believe that it is right, and it's as though now, yeah, right. It's as though now they're coming out the woodworks, right? And they're being more vocal than they ever had. They've had these feelings. Many of them have had these feelings, but now they're being more vocal. I think because of the just toxicity that seems to just be infiltrating all of our systems.
But here's why they have to be more vocal, because we're putting a demand on them. So I know people have their feelings about social media and technology. And for those of y'all on this panel know, I'm an advocate for social media, right? We know it can be a tool or a weapon. And so they're being more vocal now, one, because more Black people have $1, right? So we have more buying power than we've had, in previous generations. And we have been able to put a demand via social media. We have been saying, if you're my white friend and you're quiet, I'm talking to you. We've been able to literally say, I'm talking to my white friends. I'm talking to my quiet friends over here. And then we're putting demands on companies when we're starting to see no Gap. You cannot advertise a t-shirt with a monkey on it and we're going to keep coming to your store. So that's going to be a change in how we handle you. No, Amazon, you can't let somebody produce this. So the social media, the use of social media as a platform, right? Which has allowed people like us as faith leaders to take our pulpit to the marketplace. because that's where we can make some change. When we start shifting in how much money you're going to make and our money being spent in your organization and your institution, and we're seeing these overt racial responses. Is right after George Floyd died, we saw the rise in the purchase of the book about white fragility. So it's not that you didn't know it didn't exist. Suddenly now I want to study. Now the book is sold out. Now you want to ask those same Black friends that you were walking past, after Trayvon Martin died quietly at work, or after Mike Brown. Now you want to ask, well, what should we do? We're not here to educate you. We are, though, keeping you responsible as an ally or a person, because we want you to see how much this impacts you, right? How it all connects, race, gender, religion, politics, like it all connects. And so I think that because we put a demand on people while we were able to use social media for Black Lives Matter movement to be able to get information out, now we're also using it to put we are blocking pages, we are reporting pages. We are putting reviews out there. Don't buy from this company. I mean, what was it, Wayfair, when they started talking about them selling children in the middle of in container? I don't know if it was Wayfair or one of them, but they started talking about so the fact that we are putting information out there makes a huge difference in how people respond to it. But it's us putting a direct demand on these quiet allies.
Yeah, we're holding
ally if you're quiet.
Right, we're holding them accountable. Like, if you say this is who you are, then come on, let's get with it. Let's make this happen. And I see in that, because you bring up a great point, Dominique, about us using even our purchasing power, right? That this, of course, is what we know in the civil rights movement. That's ultimately what Dr. King was taken out for. Once he made that turn from, okay, we're doing more than just protesting, we're doing more than just marching, we're doing more than just trying to change policy or what have you, now we're going to actually touch your wallet. We're going to hold some funds back. One of the main things right now, we got to get the economy back up. We got to open back up. We got to go back. Folk got to go back. Businesses got to open. Restaurants got to open. Da, 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 da. No, they don't. They don't have to, but you need them to.
Right.
But the reality is, even the pandemic and being quarantined, all this stuff has probably helped more Black businesses than hurt, because most of us who do have the power of the microphone, right, power of the pulpit, even there are many of us that are telling our folks, hey, buy Black. Support Black business. If you know of a Black restaurant right now, get your food from there. If you know of a Black vendor, if you want some custom masks made, don't go online and just get them from where. No, find a Black person that's making them and get them to do it for you and pay them for it. Like to really pour back into the Black community. And I think it's something that's amazing. My hope, my prayer is that it just continues, right? That it keeps continuing, because only if it's sustained will it really have the effect that I think it needs to have. Hopefully it's not fly-by-night pandemic reality. Hopefully it's something that we sustain moving forward.
I don't think it is, because we're seeing it in so many other arenas, right? So we saw a shift in the enrollment of HBCUs during the pandemic. We saw a shift. There were plenty of students that were, going wherever they were going, and that's fine. But then when you start to see this racial injustice again, it's not that it didn't exist, because there again is the other benefit of social media and technology. When somebody got lynched in Mississippi, we didn't hear about it in Jersey until it was really news in a newspaper. Now, because of body cameras and devices, we're seeing it right offhand. And so there's been a shift. We've seen athletes who were being recruited by Big Ten schools who've made decisions to go to HBCUs because they recognize that there is safety in the Black community. They can critique the Black community and the Black church about a lot of things, but what you cannot critique us about is the safety of just being Black. Maybe we can argue about your age, about your gender, about your sexuality, we'll argue all day in-house, but you cannot argue that the Black space is still not safe for being Black, for being brown. And in these United States of America, it's dangerous. We are armed and dangerous just for being Black. And so we saw the shift of and that's a buck, that's a dollar, that's money power right there. When you see these athletes start making decisions, and then you even see the pro athletes making decisions about whether or not they're gonna play.
Yeah.
based off of what's happening in society. And so I'm an optimist. Maybe in my community, I don't believe it's, fly by night. I think it will definitely sustain. For sure. It's just a matter of, again, will we be heard, and will we truly stick together after this? Like when we get through this, because there will be another side, right? That's the churchy side. There will be another side of this, but will we really stick together through this? And I think, again, it's about those who have whatever perception of power, using it wisely.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Well said. I don't disagree with anything that Dean Robinson has said quite eloquently. I do agree with her that I'm optimistic about how we endure as a community. I'm less optimistic, though, I have to say, about the sustainability of the allyship that we have been talking about previously, right? I don't know that that will be sustained because, of course, white supremacy has always succeeded, and capitalism has always succeeded by means of divide and conquer. And capitalism, nor white supremacy, is going to sit idly by and watch us, allow us to pull the strings of the economy without offering some benefit to those with white skin privilege to have that privilege compounded somehow, to set us in opposition. Now, I will say this too. Though I am less optimistic, I do wonder if the sort of profusion of allies that was remarked upon previously might be generational. Because of course, it depends on the sort of pervasiveness of social media and the reach that social media has with Americans, which is not even across the generation. So we're also having to contend with those in my generation and above my generation who don't have the same relationship to social media, and yet they're the ones who sit on the boards, these corporate boards, who make decisions. They're the ones on Wall Street who are helping to shape policy, right? So it remains to be seen, to me, whether those folks in positions of power will remain with us, or will it be convenient for them to be white again? And by that, I mean white in opposition to our blackness.
Yeah.
It remains to be seen. It really does. 45 was not, he got there by democratic means, by electoral means, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
By an electoral means. So for as many as there are of us who are having this conversation, there's an equal number, at least, having the same conversation, but with an opposite disposition, if you would.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. I'm good. Yeah, that I like that. I like that.
Can I also say what's especially tragic to me is that the allyship that we have seen, God bless, has been provoked, as it were, has come into being by way of the spectacle of Black death. And it had to be a spectacle, right? It had to be seen on a body camera. It had to be seen on social media for that to happen. We can't continue to have that kind of conditional allyship that depends first on somebody being visibly and spectacularly murdered in order for you to believe what Black people have been saying for generations. So I'm less, I'm a little more critical about, not that anybody's not critical here. Maybe I should put it differently. I'm a little less optimistic about the sustainability of allyship, at least among people in my generation and above it, than I am with those um, who are millennials, because I teach millennials, and I just have to hope that my teaching is making a difference in their lives. I have to believe that critical race theory does matter, not just for Black students, right? So again, I don't disagree with Dean Robinson, but I do want to make that generational distinction. Um, that part for me remains to be seen.
Yeah, yeah. And I think also because you bring something out that I think is important. You know, when we had saw the shooting in the school in Florida, right? I think is a case in point of the generational kind of difference that you're talking about, where those students in that moment, they 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 genuinely were calling their parents and grandparents to get over themselves and make some substantive changes for their sakes. And, you know, those friendships, alliances, and all that didn't just start because of that tragedy. These were folks, they got along before then. And we see it all the time. Kids typically get along. They don't see all, we condition them to see what they see and to feel the way they feel and think the way they think often. That conditioned stimulus and response piece or what have you. And so I kind of tend to agree with you that I think I do see that being more sustainable in the younger generations, and a little different in the older generation. I think Dean Robinson and I are like in the middle, like we're like right sandwiched in the middle. I think in a generation that has so much potential to do some great things and to really be great, but a lot of leanings toward those generations that are before us. And so yeah, that's interesting.
For sure. But this is where I would beg the Black church to become responsible. Millennials are in our mid to late 30s trying to pay Sally Mae back. The generations that we are watching protesting really are Gen Zs and the Alpha generation thereafter, without proper education and training. There was no there were no freedom schools for them to learn how to protest without violence, how to discern and see who's infiltrating your protest to cause a ruckus. And there's a difference between a protest and a riot. So that educational component hasn't been passed on. And so, you know, you're talking about like, yeah, you know, I'm sorry, I'm reading the book on Frathia Hall right now. So I'm thinking about those freedom schools right now. There were systems set up to learn how to fight properly, and then to see, like I said, who didn't belong. And so when we're talking about like you said, generationally with the allyship, you got to see that somebody with a hoodie in the heat is not out here to protest, but is looking different, right? And you also need to know you don't need your phone on capturing every moment, but while you're out on the street so that you're not easily identified. So I think that this is where I'm begging the Black church to become responsible again in training and educating those who will be on quote unquote the front line, right? And then again, those who are at the table making decisions. The church used to be a space for education, planning, and strategizing, and going through waves. I myself, just a month ago, spent some time in Louisville, and it was interesting to sit down again with a mixture of people who sat and said, who's the first wave going in? All right, after they get arrested, who's the second wave going in? Who's bailing people out? Who has the money? When is the food coming in? Everybody can't go down at the same time. In the midst of the pandemic, then where's the health team? So these things are things that we learned as millennials from our foremothers and fathers who sat us down and had these conversations, from pastors and faith leaders and mothers of the church who taught us that I don't think are teaching Gen Z and the Alpha. So I'm begging the Black church and HBCUs to start having that space again for proper training for how do we do resistance differently. So what does it mean now in the middle of a pandemic where maybe you can't be out in protest, but can you write letters? Do you know who you should be writing letters to? Hold a virtual town hall meeting. How do you educate people on what's on the ballot and the bill for your area? And so for me, this is where religion plays a part, right? So if you're gonna go back to our very first question and conversation about being a theologian, fine. This is where being a theologian matters, to seeing a difference in using your way of how God engages and what justice looks like, educating generations of those who will make sure that this fight continues, and it's a smart fight. And again, like you said, I think that allyship generationally is going to shift and change because, again, who benefits from what's happening? That's and right. Even those who are younger are benefiting greatly, and they don't want to lose that, because as we talk about the millennial generation and thereafter, there's a sense of entitlement. Let's be very clear. There's a sense of entitlement, and there's a sense of, I call it the trophy generation. Everybody played the sport. Both soccer teams played. One team lost, and they got a trophy just for showing up. So you're dealing with a generation who doesn't have resilience, who doesn't know what it means to receive a no, and then fighting for without a proper education and allyship. There needs to be some education. So I'm begging the Black church and HBCUs to get back in place where we educate people, both Black and white, Hispanic and Korean, on how to fight for justice appropriately.
Yeah.
Speaking my language, Dr. Robinson, I think that is the call upon educational institutions, and I would include the church in that, right? But the elephant in the room is that our institutions began to drink the Kool-Aid. We became more focused on assimilation as opposed to true equal integration. And so when you began to, you internalize the belief that white ice is colder than black ice, your philosophies, your practices, even your ministries start to mimic that. So there needs to be a re-education of the Black church, because you don't want to further exacerbate the problem by teaching them bad practices. We before you got on, Dean Robinson, we were talking about golf, right? I think golf is a good analog, right? You'll never become a good golfer if you continue bad practices, right? You got to unlearn what you've been doing. So the Black church, in a sense, has to unlearn some very bad practices. The good news is, in our beginnings, we had powerful practices of resistance. The Black church was born in resistance, and we knew how to fight against the systems that were suppressing and oppressing us, denying our very humanity. So that has to come back to the discourse of the Black church. We have become so, and it is inevitable because we're proximate racists, right? When you become, if you go to institutions, and all of us have been to them, institutions that privilege Eurocentrism and privilege capitalism and imperialism, then you begin to take on those attributes, even unwittingly. And so it's no mistake that evangelical theology, messed us up. We began thinking like white evangelicals. That's how we got the prosperity gospel.
Yep.
That wasn't us, but we began to imbibe that, and it became the near death of us. So we've got to unprogram ourselves, deprogram ourselves from all of that in order to properly teach this generation. And Dean Robinson, you're exactly right. We have put an unfair burden on millennials and Gen Xers. We did that to them. We miseducated them both in principle and in precept and in practice. We did that to them. So we've got to accept responsibility, and that collective we is the Black community in general, the institutions that have responsibility for educating, and that is both the church and for Black folks, our first education was the church, right? And our institutions that we refer to are our HBCUs. Most of them were planted, supported sponsored by the church. So we knew the power of education. We knew that that was the way out. But over time, it became, and I hate to say it, it became corrupted. And so even though we're doing great things, the disease is still among us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's true. It's still there. And we do have to work to turn it around. Of course, you know, turning an institution, and you said we have to unlearn some things. Turning an institution is you're in the process of doing that at Clinton College as a college professor or a college president rather, you know, and us as pastors are trying to do that in our churches. Those of us who are woke, you know, we're trying to get them to unlearn some things. And of course, you experience some resistance even. And there's even resistance within the Black community when we do look at this spectacle of Black death and all of these other things that to even we've been conditioned even to prioritize certain death over other deaths, right? To prioritize the Trayvon Martins and George Floyd's over the Sandra Bland's and the Breonna Taylors, right? And we see it in our churches and institutions that that whole, you know, misogynistic kind of leaning, right? Whether knowingly or unknowingly, however it may come about. And so I kind of want to ask this question, particularly because there are two men on here who have daughters, right? Who have at least one. I know Dr. McCorn has a daughter. I know Dr. Wallace, you have two. Everybody's always talking about what they tell their Black sons, right? And what they say to their Black sons in this day and age. But I want you to tell us, what do you say to your daughter? What do you say to your daughters right now? Like, you know, because I don't think we hear that enough. And I know Dean Dominique got something to say on that too. But I'm gonna let y'all go first because you have daughters, right?
Well, I'll jump in here. I think education by nature is more observation first than, you know, intentional teaching of lessons. The lessons are learned by observing actions. And I set that up to say that my daughter learned first by watching the way I treated her mother. And then the way I told her brothers how to treat her and her mother. And I just give a little illustration. My kids tell it all from time to time. There've only been a couple of times that they've seen their daddy really go off. And it was one instance where JC, my youngest, almost assaulted Malika. I mean, they were upset, and then and at the same time, he spoke back to his mother in a way that I'd never heard him. And I wasn't even in the room, but I heard it. I think I was upstairs, and I came down the flight of stairs, probably in 2 steps, and grabbed him by the collar and put him, before I even thought about it, put him up against the wall and said something to the effect, "Don't you ever, as long as you're Black, disrespect your mother or your sister," right? And they all were in horror as they watched it, right? But it was illustrative of, you know, what I was trying to teach him, not only in that moment, but throughout life, that you cannot do that to our sisters. I mean, you shouldn't do it to anybody, but certainly don't ever get it in your mind that your masculinity gives you that kind of authority to disrespect a woman that way, right? So I think it's by observation, but then I do think that we have to, and there's a great burden on parents, but we also need to know that it does take a village to raise a child. And so I think it's important to place our sons in places that are healthy, that promote healthy masculinity as opposed to toxic masculinity. It teaches them about how to love, honor, and cherish our sisters, but also to realize that they're not dolls, right? That women have agency, that have just as much to contribute as you do. You know, all of the things that you want to put them in places where they can learn that. So it reinforces what you try to teach them at home, they get to see it in other places. And we all know when you're raising children, it is their peers and their teachers that have more impact on them than their parents do. At certain points of their lives, they just think parents, we sound like Charlie Brown's teacher. Wah, 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 right? It's just what parents say. But someone else can say the same thing, and they think that it is, a word from on high. And I don't have a problem with that, as long as they are reinforcing the good lessons that you want them to get.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you also for the question. And I'm surprised that I've not been asked the question before, but maybe not, because I don't think I have a gendered conversation with my children. Maybe because I don't have sons. But I also think that my inclination is to tell my daughters the same thing I would tell my sons, and to tell my sons the same thing that I tell my daughters. Now, I'm especially blessed because I think, to President McCorn's point, that my children have both observed my interactions with others. They have heard me in the pulpit. They have seen me read and teach from the books on my shelves. So I've never had to do a great deal in the way of intentional lecture to my children. In fact, our house is more often seminar room. And when my youngest daughter was in 8th grade, we were having very sophisticated conversations and debates. Debates in which I found myself getting exercised a bit because she was good. And she developed a critical mind. Both of my children have very good critical minds. I don't worry for their sort of intellectual understanding of how the world works, or I don't worry about their capacity to not understand how power is being used against them, for example. And I don't worry a lot about them being deceived. But of course, they're young women, and youth in itself, whatever the gender, is often sometimes it doesn't see a fuller picture, right? Or as full a picture as you would want for your children to see. I've learned a lot from my daughters, and we've had some really, really good conversations. They get it as much as I do, I think. They don't always have the vocabulary I have, or access to other resources that would necessarily make them feel like they were as competent as I am, but they're quite sharp. And I might ask that same question to them. Like, what do you intend to tell your children? What do you intend to tell your son? What do you intend to tell your daughter? I think they know a great deal by the kinds of conversations that I share with their mother, that I share with them. But it's, I'm an academic. So as I said, our house is always a seminar going on. And I'm not always the instructor. So that's the best way I can answer that question.
Yeah, I like that. And I can see your youngest daughter holding court with you, because she has always been one of the very sharp and quick-witted ones.
Too much sometimes.
And Dr. Baxter, if I can interject, but if you don't mind, Dr. Robinson, before you respond to it, I left off an important part about the daughter, because your question really was about the daughter, right? So I talked about, the sons, but my daughter Malika is brilliant, right, in her own right, and I think in part is because at least my perception of it is that she never saw herself in any way, and anyone that knows Malika knows, playing second fiddle to anyone, and especially her brothers. As much as she loves and adores and respects her brothers, she was never, a wilting violet in any way. And I always encourage that in her, right? And so guess what? And I think there is a tendency stereotypically for men to take great pride in their sons, and we always use the sort of the stereotype of the daughter having daddy wrapped around her finger and that kind of thing. And although that is true, I mean, daughters do have sons have their daddies wrapped around their fingers. But also, I think I always tried as hard as I could to give Malika equal opportunities. And whenever she tried anything, I was there. Just like the proverbial father showing up at the baseball and football and basketball games for sons, whatever Malika was in, I showed up for that too. It was a way of affirming her and, celebrating the gift that she had and in all the different things that we do. I think that that's just really important. And of course, Dr. Dominique can talk about this in her own way, but daughters need their fathers just as much as sons need their fathers. And I think that that's really important for fathers to always remember that. And we are wary of the world that Black men are growing up in, but we need to be equally concerned about the world that young Black women are growing up in, and fathers need to be vigilant in that regard.
Dean, you have anything to add to that?
I think these fathers have spoken very well about what they would say to their daughters. I can say that I am a living witness to, so my dad wasn't this type of dad, but I grew up, I am a village child. I am literally the example of it takes a village to raise a child. Being a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church for much of my life. I officially joined at the age of 18, but I was attending AME Zion churches all throughout my high school my high school experience. And it really was the men in my life in the church that played a role as uncle and brother and showed me what behaviors not to accept from other men. And so I will say that it definitely was by observation, an observation of defense of me and affirmation of me, even when I wasn't in the room, that made such a difference and still makes a difference in the confidence I believe I have when I enter into spaces. Even now professionally, I am where I am because of Dr. McCorn speaking my name in rooms where I didn't even know it needed to be mentioned. And I still today, when I think I've been disrespected or I'm questioning how to respond, I call him, screenshot, is this appropriate? Because if it's not, tell me how to respond, because I'm still questioning as a woman, am I supposed to, or how do I do that? And how does that happen? So I guess I want to say for those who will be watching, not even as a father, but just as a male in any woman's life, being able to know that you're present for support, for affirmation, for protection, is important. And so, and not to even make it just an aesthetic thing, but letting us know that we're beautiful without taking advantage of us is also important. And so I think that, for the fathers, the uncles, the brothers, the cousins, the god brothers, to do that is important. So I'll say that as a daughter, as a sister, as a niece, that I'm grateful for fathers like Dr. Wallace and Dr. McCorn, and brothers like Dr. Baxter, who help for little girls like me who didn't have the father figure, but definitely have the male presence that helps us to continue to navigate life when we question things like a Breonna Taylor and a Sandra Bland.
Right.
To know that if anything happened to me, somebody would still be saying my name and fighting on my behalf.
Right. And yeah, and so I really just, there's one more, I guess, question that's kind of burning a hole in my mind that the good Dean brought up a minute ago, but and then I kind of want to go around and give kind of some final thoughts from each of you. But you bring up these professional athletes, right? Particularly now, professional athletes, you know, that many remember Charles Barkley saying years ago that I'm nobody's role model, you know, and he can rightfully say that. Of course, any of us can say that, always. But the reality is, when you are in a certain public light, um, folk are watching, whether you know it, whether you want them to or not, whether you think you're worth watching or not. Um, you know, and I remember I was watching the one of the WNBA games the other day, and one of my good friends and sisters, Jasmine Thomas, who is a Duke University grad. Perhaps she was even one of your students, Dr. Wallace, at Duke, but she, you know, now plays for the Connecticut Sun, WNBA, and she gave a statement at halftime of the game talking about Breonna Taylor and reminding those with listening ear to pay attention to everything that was going on and on and on and on, but using her voice and then following it up on social media and all these things. And of course, we also know of several other professional athletes that have now begun to put their money behind their statements of social justice, what have you. And I've said for a long time that I think one of the biggest opportunities for the Black community is within our professional athletic ranks. That you have a lot of not just economic potential and influence, but also just societal influence by virtue of popularity within these professional sports. And so what do you all feel is the promise, you know, that might be seen in what's going on right now, or is it sustainable is probably a better question. Is it sustainable, or is it going to be kind of a fleeting thing? You know, we do know that several of these college athletes are, you know, transferring to HBCUs. The question now is, of course, you know, are they going to get on the athletic side what they might need if they do aspire to go to the next level, things like that. And I even saw the other day that a young man transferred to Jackson State after hearing Deion Sanders named as coach. Does more of that kind of need to happen in order to do things like this? But I think that whole picture is something that needs to be addressed, because we do, you know, by and large, infiltrate athletics in this nation. We are the majority, almost across the board. Of course, there are sports where we are not, but it's arguable that minorities make up the majority of every sport. Even baseball, the majority of the players are from the Caribbean. And you know, in soccer, of course, we know that. And then, of course, football, basketball, majority are African American. So how do you reconcile that? What do you think about that? Do you think it's a way forward to help, you know, alleviate some things in our communities?
Well, I'll start, if it's okay. I think it's a complicated issue because professional sports is an extremely lucrative industry. And it is almost unfair for young Black men and women to be put in the ethical quandary that they are often put in after having done everything that they were supposed to do to get to this place where they might be able to rescue themselves and their families from financial struggle, to now have to make a decision for themselves, for their families, now for their communities, to risk it. And it's very noble for any of them to decide that their communities have such significant value to them that they would risk it. On the other hand, I don't know that I really want to judge an 18, 19, 20-year-old who is being offered a great deal of money. And let's also say that's why it's complicated, not because even the decision, the ethical decision is difficult, but because even if our athletes unilaterally make a certain kind of decision, symbolically, maybe even politically, materially, for the sake of the value of Black lives, again, we cannot be deluded into believing that the owners of these teams are just going to sit back and watch it. They're going to have, in other words, we have to make sure that as we're training activists on the ground, that athletes also get an education. To me, it is a shame that an athlete can attend a D1 school, move immediately to professional sports, and never have had any education about how to manage finances. That's what a school owes that athlete. But it's also important, I think, that we teach our athletes, we teach our young people generally, that checkers strategy won't work in a chess game. And I think power brokers are often playing chess. They've already imagined the possibility of these athletes sort of acting in a way that is not in the owner's financial interest. So what then? So I'm like Dean Robinson, I'm pleading with Black institutions to get involved with educating, especially our young people, but educating ourselves about how power works, about how intractable power sometimes is. And I think I'd leave it at that, except I do want to say that it's interesting that your first illustration, Dr. Baxter, was WNBA, because I think, frankly, that the WNBA's activism has been more significant than NBA activism, which reminds me that, and takes us back to our earlier question, that we had better pay better and closer attention to women's activism. Because women's activism, historically speaking, when we go to write the history of the civil rights movement, it gets background, right?
Right.
Even though, you know, the founding of the Montgomery Improvement Association included women, right, who get excised from the history. And we had better listen to the Jasmine Thomases, and we had better listen to young Black girls tell us what their experiences are. I think it's crucial that for men like me and President McCorn to be better fathers, we got to also hear what our daughters' experiences are. We know our experiences, so we tend to know our sons' experiences, but we don't know our daughters' experiences quite as well. I'm fortunate in that I teach literature, so I get the opportunity to read women's accounts of their lives and their girlhoods a lot. And there's so much more I still don't know, but it's incumbent upon me to keep reading and to keep learning, so that I understand better the experiences of the ones who are actually out front in our political struggles. I owe it to them. I owe it to my daughters. And let me add, by the way, however brilliant my daughters are, and they are brilliant, I'm with Dr. McCorn on that. It's not exclusively because of me. They have a brilliant mother.
That's right. Thank God.
And yes, and she is professionally successful. She is smart. She is beautiful. They have only to watch her. And I suppose I'm support staff or something. They have only to watch her to be to fulfill their potential, to realize their talents, and to be the kind of women who will ultimately become Dean Robinsons, prayerfully. So let's not forget to highlight how important it is, whether we're talking about sports or activism generally, that women are out front very often, but when the story gets told, somehow they get backgrounded, and it's to our detriment.
I'll add, and in church.
Amen. Amen. I think that
Did
also,
I say that out loud?
right. I think that also speaks to the importance of solidarity.
Yeah.
And what solidarity should look like. And I think this is a great moment. And you're right, the WNBA, I mean, those sisters took the lead, and it would make good sense for the men to be in solidarity with the NBA to be. Now, I do see hope in Chris Paul, who, by the way, is going to an HBCU, I understand. He's going to Winston-Salem State now.
Mm-hmm.
He never finished his degree, I guess, at Wake Forest. And so he's going to Winston-Salem. And of course, you know, before every game, he wore some gear from an HBCU. So wonderful thing. And so I think his wokeness, and he's, by the way, he's the president of the NBA Players Association, Chris Paul. So, you know, his awareness is helping to move these brothers into that space. But you hit it right on the head. It does have to do with the way that they are educated. And there is probably undue pressure on an 18, 19-year-old who's given millions of dollars now and is idolized, you know, by, you know, countless young people all over the globe. And there's a lot of pressure on them. And I think this is instructive for us to think about the NBA as a corporation. It is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. And the same kind of discussions we're having around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the corporate world, sports cannot be, you know, outside of that conversation. And so it is incumbent upon the NBA to also think about how it orients and educates players about how this thing really works. There's great risk in it because obviously the owners make money off of these players, and it is in their interest for the players to remain ignorant to a degree. But there's another component about, I often think about when I hear young players speak, and it shouldn't be this way, but I'm amazed, you know, I get so excited when I hear a brother who can express himself so powerfully and politically. It's almost like you don't expect that, you know, from players. But there also, I think it also is related to emotional intelligence that I think gets left out of the equation. And I think this is where our institutions could come alongside our players and help develop that emotional intelligence that then fuels their own sense of humanity, their own sense of agency in this matter. Because if you are immature, right, you're gonna speak immature. It's gonna be about money, right? I gotta get mine. You know, it's about my family. You know, I'm about to bring my family out the ghetto. We're about to get a big house, you know, and although I don't disparage anyone who wants to advance themselves, we got to help them understand that there's much more to life than that. because your playing career can end like that. All it takes is one injury and you're done. Or even if you are the well-conditioned athlete and have a long career, that career is going to end, right? So you got to think about life after basketball. And so I think helping them understand the world in which they have to operate, both the microcosm and the macrocosm of how the world operates, I think that's really important. And it does include politics. And so, you know, I think it's important for, you know, I thank God for LeBron James. But LeBron James, it took a while for him to become the person that he is now. You know, he's now the senior statesman of the NBA, and he's become a good spokesman, and he's putting his money where his mouth is. But wouldn't it have been wonderful when he came out of high school that someone could have nurtured him early on? Last thing I want to say is I think it's also hurting us that players are not going to college. They're able to go straight from high school to the pros, or, you know, 1 year, sort of a, you know, a perfunctory year in college. They're really not paying attention, and they're just, you know, trying to make the money. I think there is a role to be played there in developing them emotionally as well as intellectually as they, you know, mature.
Yeah. Dean Robinson, you have anything to add with that?
The only thing I want to add is that I think we need to work on decentralizing the power of the professional athletes and celebrity artists who we expect to speak on our behalf. I think it was Dr. Jeremiah Wright who spoke about how either an athlete or a celebrity artist has more power or influence than the preacher, even on the church, which is problematic. And so I think that we need to start reimagining what we see as leadership. The fact that we put so much weight on a person who is seen so public is so problematic because they don't live in our neighborhoods and in our churches and in our school systems. We see it, or we have seen it at least, with the birthing of the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of Trayvon Martin, which was founded by 3 women, right? And even of those women, queer persons. And then we find ourselves years later having to come up with a hashtag of say her name, right? So we need to rework how we see leadership, taking away the patriarchy and the capitalism and the imperialistic tendencies around it, so we can start being clear about the fact that everybody has that responsibility, but also understanding that for those who are celebrities, there are complexities to putting food on their table that we want to be mindful of when we think that they should be having a say so and how they should be. There's a risk. We all know, everybody on this line is a preacher. There's a risk to be a prophet. And in the risky business is you could be losing your home, your family, your influence, your career that got you to the place that you even have that microphone. And so what happens then when the person who is the leader or not even, because, you know, I don't believe in one leadership, you know, that's the ethos of the Black Lives Matter movement, is that we all are, this is shared leadership. And so what happens when we start saying that responsibility is on all of us? And then make it okay for a person who might be a celebrity or have that platform. Maybe you don't even have to say anything because we're doing the work. And people understand that what the local leaders are saying actually has more weight than the person who has the money and the microphone on the television. And I know that's a culture shift, but I do think that's something that we need to start doing internally for ourselves. I think that's what has to happen. We saw it happen with the civil rights movement. We made Martin Luther King the leader when we know, almost cussed, darn well, you know, you had a Prathia Hall and a Fannie Lou Hamer and a Shirley Chisholm. You know, we knew darn well there was a team and a squad, inclusive of his wife, that got them together to be able to show up and speak up, right? But I think that when we start reimagining the role of leadership as shared leadership, and how important it is for not just book smarts and education, but cultural education, to learn the responsibility, the lineage, the legacy that we all are carrying, and we all must continue to educate. I think that that's going to be important if we're looking to make a difference in race, politics, and religion moving forward.
Got you. Well, I appreciate that. I certainly do. I appreciate all that has been discussed this day and said and all these things. And so I guess as a way of a final thought from each of us, as you know, we are approaching an election, a pivotal election. I tend to disagree with many of those who say this is the most important election in the history of America. No, every election is just as important. I think this one you see the contrast a lot a lot bigger. It's a lot more evident. But if there was one word of advice, or a word of, yeah, I guess just a word of advice that you would give a first-time voter in this election, what would that be? This will kind of serve as our last time around. Just what would that one piece of advice be to a first-time voter in this election? I'll begin with Dean Robinson.
A first-time voter, I would probably ask them to go watch a couple of episodes of Schoolhouse Rocks. But what I would do is I would ask them to do their homework, to learn about what is going to be on the ballot, what matters are most important, and to vote in such a way that you would want for yourself and your family. That would be my advice for a first-time voter.
Gotcha. Dr. McCorn?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think education is the key, and I think you have to, all politics is local, right? Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the House of my home state of Massachusetts, said all politics is local, but every local decision has global implications. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to tell our young people, we all work in institutions of higher education, so we teach first-time voters, right? Yeah. And I think it's important to tell them that they must have multi-dimensional view. Don't go in voting only for yourself. It's all self-interested, but you got to look beyond yourself. The politics or elections have consequences. Yeah. And I think they have to understand how consequential their vote is in the grand scheme of electoral politics.
Yeah. Right, Dr. Wallace.
In addition to all of the brilliant counsel you just heard from my co-panelists, I suppose I would add only one or two brief things. Probably first, vote your conscience. Of course, having arrived at a stance by way of the sort of education, self-educating experiences that Dr. Robinson and Dr. McCorn have advised, but vote your conscience. And to first-time Black voters, mm-hmm. I would say, after all of that, honor the ancestors who made it possible for you to exercise this right.
Yeah. I like that. Don't be afraid to get into some good trouble at the polls. Shout out to the late great John Lewis. Well, I certainly thank you all for being here. I would just say with this election, kind of the same thing, to just, don't be afraid to get into some good trouble at the polls. Don't be afraid to vote your conscience and really believe that I agree that the local is important. It does have global implications. We often overlook our local elections, but definitely pay attention to them. Because that's where many of your school board policies are implemented, and many of the things that you feel happen on the local level, that you feel instantly. And so I certainly agree with all of that. I tell you, this has been amazing. This has been a great gathering of great minds. I am just excited that I even know you know each of you. I'm just honored to be in the room as the bootleg scholar that I am. Among all you great scholars, no, we're just great. I'm grateful. It's been an awesome time that we've had, and I hope that those of you who have tuned in and have experienced this conversation, I hope and pray that you realize the depth and breadth of the Black intellectual experience. We're not called just to be in some academic silo somewhere, but the Black academic is called to be a public intellectual as well. We're called to also be able to get into the public square and be a vernacular, to borrow Dr. McCorn's word, a vernacular academic as well as a vocational academic. And so I thank each of you, Dr. Wallace and Dean Robinson and President McCorn. That sounds like a pretty good stop right there. We're in good company. I thank each of you for lending of your time, your talent. We haven't taken up an offering, so you haven't lended your treasure, but we certainly thank you for your time and your talent. I'm Baptist now, I'll collect an offering in a heartbeat. And to all of you who are watching, we thank you for tuning in. We thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, by all means, let us know. Simply reach out to us at stayconnected@sbcsw.org. Stay connected at sbcsw.org. And you send us the questions, and if it's directed at one of our panelists, I will be sure that they get it and that they can respond to whatever question you may have, as they are certainly open to engaging with all of you about these various issues. So I thank you again. I thank our panelists again. This has been awesome, and I look forward to the next time when we can gather together, hopefully in person, to have discussions like this as well. All right, so thank you all for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you at a future Second Baptist production. God bless you.
Thanks for joining Dr. Baxter and his panel guests on this important topic, race, religion, and politics. This event is part of the annual Lead Conference presented by Second Baptist Church southwest of District Heights, Maryland. Remember, whatever you do, make sure you vote.